Hello and welcome to this short presentation which is intended to introduce the report Crop Science Formulations 2020, which has been published by IHS Markit's Agribusiness Intelligence. My name is David Calvert and together with my colleague Jim Bullock we wrote this report. So Jim and I formed iFormulate in 2012 and we're a consultancy which specialises in the science, technology and commercialisation of formulation science. We are active in all industries which make use of formulation science technology, and we've undertaken many assignments from clients in the agrochemical area. For Agribusiness Intelligence, we have previously authored reports on formulation in 2016, sustainability in agrochemicals and bioformulations earlier this year in 2020. The report we are talking about today, Crop Science Formulations 2020, is already available, and at the end of this presentation you'll find details of how to purchase and to get more details. On the right hand side here you'll see the chapter listing, and I will make a start with chapter 1. So as with all of these reports, you do need to set the scene, and in chapter 1 we do just that. We start off by looking at what is formulation, why do people formulate, what are their objectives, and particularly in context with this report we look at agrochemical types of formulation and the codes which we use frequently throughout the report. It would be remiss to not reflect upon the market trends which impact on formulation, and amongst those we'll definitely look at the mergers and acquisitions, and the obvious ones there is the purchase of Monsanto by Bayer, the merger of Dow and DuPont to form Corteva, and also acquisitions by UPL and FMC, and examine how they may have affected the formulation aspects. We also reflect on some of the summaries and what previous reports actually said was going to happen in formulation. And in the last report that we wrote, we reflected on what we thought might happen with regards to the regulatory landscape. We spoke about what we thought would happen with actives, inerts and formulations, and we saw how mixtures and resistance were having a significant effect on formulation. And we will consider those aspects as we go through this report, but we just introduced that in chapter 1. So that's enough on chapter 1. It's now Jim's turn to take over and take you through chapter 2. So over to you, Jim.
Thanks, David. In chapter 2, we provide an overview of all of the many formulation types used for crop protection products. We start by looking at the ingredients of formulation, the various co-formulants and adjuvants that are used to provide stability, to give you good handling, to enable convenient application and to optimize the efficacy of the product. The application method is one of the main factors to consider when choosing the formulation type for your product. We review these application methods briefly. Spray tank is the most significant commercially, but many products are still applied dry without dilution in a spray tank, and seed treatments are a growing area of importance as well. The manufacturing process for making formulations is just as important as the co-formulants chosen. For instance, there are different ways of making water dispersible granule formulations, and each method results in granules with different application properties. We also take a look at formulation stability. Stability, whether it be during manufacture, transport, storage or use of the product, is probably the most fundamental property that a formulator has to contend with. And we finish this chapter by taking a look at the main tests used to evaluate the properties and performance of formulations. Chapter 3 has a commercial rather than a technical focus, and we take a look at what are the most important formulation types commercially. We do this in a number of ways, by market value, market volume and by number. We then drill down to look at the most significant formulation types in several categories: herbicides, fungicides, insecticides and seed treatments. And here is an example of this market view analysis. Here are the commercially most important formulation types for crop protection chemicals. On the left is a breakdown by market value. and on the right a breakdown by volume. By value, suspension concentrates, SC formulations, and emulsifiable concentrates, EC formulations, are the most important, followed by soluble liquid concentrates, SL, and water dispersible granules, WG. The picture changes, however, when looking by volume. Here, the SL formulations are clearly the largest by volume. This is because large volumes of generic glyphosate is sold at relatively low unit prices in SL format. Conversely, the WG formulation drops down the list when measured by volume, and the granules, GR, for dry application, move up when measured by volume rather than value. Again, many GR products are commodity based. Now we'll take a look at some of these formulation types in more detail. So over to David again.
Thanks, Jim. So in chapter 4 we take our first look at a specific type of formulation, and we start with emulsifiable concentrates, which have the 2-letter code of EC. We use the approach in almost all of these chapters of starting with looking at the leading actives, who are the companies making those actives and what are the brands that they do. We start to look also at formulation components, and in emulsifiable concentrates, those are mainly obviously the solvent or the oil where the active is dissolved, plus the emulsifiers that help it to form an instant emulsion in the spray tank. But in the case of ECs, there are other additives sometimes added either into the formulation or into the spray tank, and we examine those as well. We look at what the patent activity is for those main actives that we've identified, and in many cases we see that that's either coming from China or is also related to mixtures of actives. And we look at general literature activity, which gives an indication sometimes of how much emphasis is being put on this formulation type. And then, as in all of the chapters, we do a summary. I guess for your interest, some of the actives that we look at in emulsifiable concentrates, in herbicides, pinoxidine and clethodim. In fungicides, we look at prothioconazole, pyroclostrobin. In insecticides, we look at abamectin and chlorpyrifos. But as I said, there are many mixtures, so you'll come across different actives as well, and additional to those that I've actually spoken about. I wanted to put up this chart, which is one we use through a lot of the report. Where we've used the BCPC online pesticide manual, and we've looked at the number of actives in the different classes. So acaricide, fungicide, herbicide and insecticide, plant growth regulators, nematicide, and you'll see the number of actives listed in the BCPC online pesticide manual. The most are in insecticides and then in herbicides. But as with all chapters, and you'll see an example of that on the next slide, we also look at the value. And in that case, sometimes the value can be different from the actual number of actives that are in a certain formulation type. So in chapter 5, we take a look at another very popular formulation format, namely the suspension concentrate or SC formulation. An SC, as you probably know, is when the active ingredient is suspended in a continuous medium, which is almost always water. In this case, we again look at the formulation components, and we look at the additives that are used to stabilize those in terms of rheology and surfactants and dispersants. I said earlier we looked at different types of ways of looking at the market, and here on the right hand side you'll see how it's split by value, and in the case of suspension concentrates there's a relatively even split between fungicides, herbicides and insecticides. We look at some of the main actives, and some of the actives, for example, we examine in this chapter are atrazine, both alone and in mixtures, and also one that's used in a lot of mixtures is trifloxystrobin. On patent activity, we examine, and in terms of SC, we see an awful lot of activity in China, but we also can see how some of the majors protect the actives that are coming out of patent per se by formulation, and we use trifloxystrobin as an example of there. When we look at literature, we see that the choice and type of the dispersant to try and keep the particles apart and prevent them from settling is a key focus of research in this formulation type. And we notice that SCs are often looked at first when developing a new formulation. But of course, that's only if the active is suitable for that formulation type. So in chapter 6 we look at what might be called the simplest formulation type, the soluble liquid SL, but it is a very, very important formulation type and it's spoken about a lot, and the reason for that is not least that it's dominated by herbicides and some very high profile herbicides. You can see the split in that pie chart on the right hand side of between the different types, and you can see how 86% of the value is coming from herbicides. The actives, unsurprisingly, that we'll look at will include glyphosate and glufosinate. We examine the phenomenon of spray drift, which is very topical and has a lot of impact on actives such as 2,4-D and dicamba, and how formulation technology is trying to prevent that. And we also see how in this formulation type it's really not so much the stability that's an issue, it's more the toxicity and the impact on the environment of the active and some of the co-formulants that are included in soluble liquid formulations. So that's what we cover in chapter 6. In chapter 7 we try and capture all of the other liquid formulations that are available to the formulator, and some of those include oil in water emulsion formulations, the EW formulation type. We look at oil dispersions or OD formulations, which have become very popular and started off with actives that were sensitive to water. We look at microemulsion formulations or ME formulations. We examine capsule suspension formulations, CS, whereby the active is often encapsulated to try and prevent it from being unstable. We look at suspo emulsions, which is an interesting one and is the SE, which is where you combine a suspension with an emulsion. And we look at other mixed formulation types, and in the era where lots of mixtures are being done, then sometimes that's captured with an actual code for a mixed formulation, sometimes it's not, and we examine where those are used in some of the major commercial grades. And we obviously summarize those, and I guess in essence the summary is that there are lots of options for a formulator, but these formulations you see here tend to be used as troubleshooters when there's no other option. So the formulator will still look at the simpler types of formulations in liquids that we've talked about in terms of SC, EC and SL, and if that's not popular then they'll do that. In terms of solids, well, that's what Jim's going to deal with now, so I'm going to hand you over to Jim to talk about solid formulation types. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, David. So let's take a look at some of the solid formulation types, starting with wettable powders, WP. So here the active ingredient is a solid, and so are the formulants. Usually these are dry milled and combined to produce a powder product. The active must disperse in the spray tank to form a stable suspension, so dispersing agents are the most important of these formulants. They are simple, cost-effective formulations, but the main disadvantage is that they can be dusty, which leads to handling and exposure concerns. Also, there is little scope to add adjuvants to the formulation to enhance application properties, so these have to be added in a tank mix. In this chapter we look at how the main actives sold as WP are formulated and review the formulations used. And we also take a look at recent patents and publications on wettable powders. Here is a chart of the fields of use for WP formulations. Fungicides are commercially the most significant, followed by insecticides. The majority of active ingredients for these categories are water insoluble, so WP is a suitable format. Compared to the overall picture in the market, herbicides are relatively underrepresented as WP. This is because many of the main herbicide actives are water soluble, and therefore other formulation formats such as SL are more significant. Let's move on now to take a look at water dispersible granules, WG formulations. Like WP formulations, these are high strength solid formulations with water insoluble active ingredients, which disperse to form a stable suspension in the spray tank. WG formulations overcome the dustiness and flow problems associated with WP by using granulation, which increases the particle size of the powder to produce free-flowing, non-dusty material. There are a number of ways of achieving this, but in all cases the formulator has to some extent to trade off granule strength versus redispersibility in the tank. WG products also have advantages when it comes to handling and operator exposure. The main drawback of WG is that of higher manufacturing costs due to the extra processing steps needed. As in the previous chapter, we look at how the main actives sold as WG are formulated and we review the formulants used. We look at the main actives used for WG as well as their formulation details, and we also take a look at recent patents and publications on water dispersible granules. Now let's look at the fields in which WG products are used. By value, about half of WG products are herbicides, with fungicides also being important, and you can see some of the main active ingredients listed here. In chapter 10 we take a look at another type of granules, this time for dry or direct application rather than for dispersing in a spray tank. Like WG products, these have a large particle size and are free-flowing as well as non-dusty. They are used for direct broadcasting, for in-furrow application, or by direct addition to rice paddies. Particle size is large and this can restrict bioavailability, and as a spray tank isn't used, there is little chance to use adjuvants to improve bioavailability. However, GR products are often coated on the surface of carriers, and this coating can be tuned to provide controlled release properties which may be desired. As in the previous chapters, we include a review of the various co-formulants used for GR products and take a look at patents and other publications. And this shows the usage split for GR products, which by value are divided fairly equally between fungicides, herbicides and insecticides. We've listed some of the main actives used in GR products, and in the chapter we describe several of their formulations in more detail. Chapter 11 is a roundup of the remaining solid formulation types. You can see the main ones on the right hand side, but DP, dustable powders, SP, soluble powders, SG, soluble granules and TB, tablet formulations are the most common of these. A number of the tablet and briquette formulations are only used for smaller niche applications. We also provide details of some of the actives and formulations of interest for these formulation types. And now it's back to David for the first special topic.
Thanks, Jim. So in the first of our special topics, we look at a formulation or an active ingredient type group that is becoming very popular, and we project will obviously continue in popularity, and that's using biocontrol for crop protection. We look at some of the definitions, we look at the market statistics and dynamics. We then start to divide that up into microorganisms, and no report on biocontrol would be complete without examining Bacillus thuringiensis, or what's known as BT. We look at how microbials are formulated and nematodes. We then look at other natural chemicals and how they are formulated. We look at the formulation skills used to make proteins, peptides and enzymes work, and we also look at future directions. I think it's fair to say that this chapter is a summary of the major bioformulations report that we issued earlier this year in 2020, and you can get many more details in that. We just examine it briefly in chapter 12. So now I'm going to hand back to Jim, who's going to take you through the second special topic.
Thank you, David. In the next chapter we take a closer look at seed treatment formulations. Application of crop protection products via treated seeds is growing in popularity. The advantages of seed treatment include a more targeted application of the active ingredient with less active going to waste, an improved environmental profile, and the potential to add controlled release properties to the product. Now, most products in this application are fungicides or insecticides. In this chapter we look at the main formulation types, which are powder or liquid analogues of some of the main formulations for spray applications and have many similarities with them. In chapter 14 we switch from formulation types to look at the companies involved in formulation, whether they are large or small suppliers of agrochemicals or involved in the formulation supply chain as providers of formulants or lab and manufacturing services. And now it's back to David one last time.
So thanks, Jim. So in this final chapter, we project forward and make our own crystal ball in terms of what we think will be the future trends in formulation. And this market is very similar to others. There are areas where we see technology push and there are areas where we see market pull. We examine some of the leading emerging technologies in general, and then we look at what we believe will be the impact of some future market drivers. And those market drivers are very similar to what we've seen before. There'll be regulation, there will be biocontrol, there will still be an increase in resistance. We believe that formulation will be key to helping to address all of those and to help them become more effective in the marketplace. And we also know that automation will have an effect on the market. And we do then also look at external disruptive technologies and how they will, we believe, affect crop protection in the future. So that's about all. We hope you found this informative, and if you want more details on the full report Crop Science Formulations 2020 and get some sample pages, then please look for more information and contact IHS Markit on the details you see on those slides. If you do decide to purchase this, we hope you find it to be of value, but we believe it's a very useful report. And that's also from Jim and myself. Thanks for listening and stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.